I'm very excited to present this work, which is, as Leonardo said, joint with Ed Glaser, Joe Giurco, Bill Kerr, and Giacomo Ponzetto. So let me do the usual disclaimer, which is that any views expressed here are ours and not of the Census Bureau. Start with the motivation for this project, which is the fact that real U.S. house prices have far exceeded the appreciation in the CPI. If we take the real U.S. house prices in the last 70 years in the U.S., they have doubled in real terms. And this is both if you take the raw house prices, but also if you correct for quality of housing, you see an even starker trend. And we found this particularly peculiar, especially when compared to another staple household item, which are cars. If you take the price of a car in real terms, that price has gone down to 40% what was in 1960. So this kind of begs the question of why are Americans so good at building things behind closed door in factories, but so bad at building structures that are fixed in space. And there is a traditional narrative in the literature, which is that part of this appreciation in houses comes from the fact that regulation limits building, and by limiting building, it restricts the amount of land legally available for development. And so, you know, by restricting one of the inputs to construction, you're going to bid up the price of the output. However, in this paper, we ask another question, which is whether regulation can, in addition to this effect that has been well documented in the literature and well discussed, can regulation also make building more expensive directly by making constructors less productive? And there is some evidence over time that indeed the construction sector has become less productive. Infrastructure costs have gone up, as shown by Brooks and Liskow, and the sector overall has suffered a very sluggish TFP growth in the last 70 years. If we take the estimates of Forster et al. 2022 at face value, the American economy in the aggregate is foregoing $1 trillion value every 5 years. So this is a huge the sector has huge macroeconomic importance, and its sluggish TFP growth seems to hurt the entire American economy. So what we do in this paper is first we document some new facts about the construction sector by characterizing the path of productivity in U.S. construction over time. The first thing that we start with is extending Goolsby and Severson series on output per employee, stretching it back to the 1900s and showing the path of construction productivity over time, and then also taking new data that shows that construction costs of constructing houses have increased over time quite substantially, and when we look at productivity in terms of output per employee, what we see is that, of course, we see the decline in productivity that Goolsby and Severson have documented since the 1970s, but we see that construction has not always been like that. It actually, its productivity rose massively between 1900 and the 1970s. And so what we're tracing out is an inverse U-shaped, which we call a productivity in Kuznets curve. Construction productivity has been rising, and then perhaps as the country has started regulating, it started plummeting down. The second fact that we show is that construction firms are extremely small and they operate on a very small scale. And this has been true especially since the 1970s. So the second part of the paper tries to understand whether regulation, which also shot up in the 1970s, can explain part of these patterns. And the model, it will be a model in which we focus on process regulation. So we think that construction regulation is a regulation that affects each single project that builders want to undertake, and it materializes in the fact that it is harder for builders to approve large construction projects. As permitting becomes very intense and has regulation on environmental protection and other kind of limits becomes more stringent, stretching across a large plot of land means having to please many local jurisdictional boards, or having to make to file many permits, and this makes it harder for the builder to actually undertake the project. So with regulation decreasing the size of projects, what happens is that these inefficiently small projects may make builders unproductive, because we assume that builders have a span of control problem. For a builder, it is easier to build 100 houses on one big plot of land rather than 100 houses on 100 small projects, because there are some costs in shuttling across projects, moving crews, coordinating different construction projects. And so these inefficiently small projects then beget small scale, and this also decreases producers' incentives to invest in technological development, and can explain why TFP has been so low in construction. The last part of the paper, and this is a point that we're gonna make, is that this is gonna be very different from a more standard form of regulation that has been covered from the literature, which is regulation of entry. It's gonna have different implications, especially on technological development. The last part of the paper tries to provide some evidence on the model, and the model makes two key links. One is regulation affects size, and the other one is size affects productivity. And so we try to show some evidence correlationally of these links by showing that larger firms in construction are indeed more productive and more capital intensive, and that across cities, we see that construction activity is depressed, and construction firms are smaller and less productive in more regulated cities. And then over time, what we see is that the construction sector has become far less innovative compared to other sectors, which again is also a consequence, within the model, is a consequence of regulation. So let me start by providing this new fact of productivity in construction. The first fact is that looks at costs and output per employee over time. And we start with plotting the cost of making a constant economic quality home. We take this cost from RS Means company, which is a company that that records building cost over a year, and it records building cost especially for a type of house that is fixed in time, and so that we can fix quality over time and just really directly measure how much is it expensive to build the same type of house. And this is our economic quality home. It's a single family house, one full bath, one kitchen with no basement. And if we look at the cost of building this home in real term, what we see is that they have not at all decreased in the last 40 years. If anything, they have appreciated. And even if you look not only over time in the US, but if you look at the US compared to other peer countries, we see that the building in the US is really more expensive compared to other developed countries. We do this by looking at international data from Turner and Townsend, which is a firm that records data on construction costs for different types of buildings all over the world. And the good thing about this data is it also records cost of inputs. And we have different costs for materials, we have different labor costs for different type of workers, and we have the cost of hiring a crane in each city in the world. And so by looking at these costs, what we can see is in the first column, I'm reporting the total cost of per square meter of building a house, and we see that this cost is much higher in New York, San Francisco, LA, than in other comparable cities in the world. We're taking the average cities for each other continent that we have, and these are Paris, Singapore, Johannesburg, and Sao Paulo, and then the world simple average. So American cities are really more expensive, but obviously part of this is explained by the fact that inputs are more expensive in American cities. This is the second column, which decomposes the total cost in unexplained component that comes from our data on cost of inputs. However, what you can see from US cities is that the unexplained portion is really high, especially for the coastal US cities. New York, San Francisco, and LA have very high unexplained residual compared to other cities in America, but also compared to other cities throughout the world. And this happens to line up exactly with the index of regulatory tightness, which is Werluri, which is an index that measures how many regulatory hurdles there are between project inception and then when actually you start building, and you see that where Werluri is high, so where regulation is very tight, this unexplained residual is very high, indicating that American cities are very expensive above and beyond the cost of inputs. So going from cost instead to output, another way of getting the productivity is measuring the output of the construction sector over time. And what we look here is housing units per employee in construction. And here we have to paste a lot of different data series from the 1900s, but we have a 120 years series over time that characterizes productivity in the construction sector. And there's obviously many details, and the paper is quite detailed on that. But overall, what we see is that by pasting this series together is that construction productivity has actually increased massively between 1900 and 1960, with a particular increase in the post-World War II boom, and then it has plateaued for 20 years and then started plummeting. This is what we call our productivity Kuznets curve. And the path of this productivity in construction is especially striking if we benchmark it against other sectors. So let me take this curve that I just traced, but let me index it to 1970 and take the log of this index. So this is the same curve in log scale. Obviously, it's less dramatic because we're taking a log scale. And we want to benchmark this curve with what happened for other sectors in the economy. And so the first sector is again tracing the parallel I started with cars, is looking at cars at an index of cars per employee in motor vehicle production. And what you see here is a substantial decoupling that started in the 1970s, 1980s between construction and cars per employee. But before that, the two actually tracked each other pretty well. It is just after the 80s that they started diverging massively. And this is not only typical of cars. If you add manufacturing output per employee, you see kind of the same pattern, a little bit even more accentuated. So while a manufacturing worker produces eight as many tokens as it used to produce at the start of our sample, an employee in the housing units produces as many homes as he used to at the start of our period. The second fact that we show, the second set of facts that we show about the construction sector is about the size of firms and size of the projects on which these firms work. If you look over time at different sectors compared to construction, what we see is that, and we plot the fraction of employment in firms with more than 25 employees as coming from the county business patterns, what we see is that construction, which are the red and the orange line in the bottom, the red line is the entire construction sector, which includes construction of bridges, highways, so a heavy and civil engineering construction. The orange line is the more residential and office building construction. And what we see is that the fraction of employment in these firms is much smaller, at around 60% for the construction sector and touching lows of 50% for general building contractors, so housing and offices you can think of. It stands in stark contrast with the rest of the economy and with manufacturing, where 90% and more of employees are employed in firms with 25 or more employees. And especially what we see is that in construction, the size of the construction firm has been declining over time, while for other sectors it has stayed roughly constant. So Another question that we can ask to characterize this size is looking today at different construction sectors and trying to understand which kind of construction firms, so based on what they produce, are small. And so here we use our census microdata to distinguish construction firms based on their source of revenue. And what I'm plotting here is the share of employment in different size bins. So you should look at the first bar on the left. This is the share of employment in housing in firms within 0 and 4 employees. And this is quite striking. It's 30% almost, which stands in stark contrast with this with the green bar, which is all the non-construction firms in the census sample, which is around 5%. And construction firms are in different shades of blue and purple. And what we see is broadly that, this blue and purple block really behaves differently compared to the green block. The construction, the distribution of employment in construction is really skewed towards small firms. And this is especially so for housing and consumer-facing buildings, and somewhat for industrial buildings, but it's obviously less true for heavy and civil engineering construction. Those firms that build bridges and highways, they are much larger, and their size, it resembles a little bit more closely the average size of non-construction firms. So then informed by the fact that these construction firms are small, we ask what's the scale of projects on which they work on. And in particular, we are really inspired by the mega builders of the 1950s. And here is Levitt on the left, head of the Levitt and Sons firms, which was a mega builder that built over massive plot of lands, projects with 15,000 and more homes. On the right, I'm showing the picture of one of those Levitt towns as they became known, which are these gigantic construction projects that were really efficient at the time, because the Levitts had figured out that if they've put houses along a road and they could develop all of them in succession, it would mirror what Ford was doing for cars, the assembly line kind of process, in which instead of moving the product, you were moving the crews along the same road. And so they became extremely efficient at building this. These houses were very affordable, and the Levitts built something like 35 houses per day using this assembly line style. So the question is, well, we were so innovative in the 50s, are these kind of large projects still in place today? And it's a tricky question to answer, because we don't have data on the size of construction projects. And so we devised a new algorithm to measure project size, which comes from CoreLogic, which has data on houses built. And we cover 167 counties, 51% of the US population. What we do with this sample is we randomly draw houses built for each pair of years t and t+1. We randomly draw houses built in this pair of years, and then we start drawing the neighbors, those houses that are 100 yards within the house that we draw, and then we continue drawing until we find neighbors. And so in this way, we are drawing neighboring houses that have all been built in the same two-year period. And so by doing so, if we find a large cluster of houses all built together, we call that all built together, close to each other in the same pair of years, we call that a project. And then our key measure will be what is the fraction of homes that are built in each pair of years that are built within the top 1% of projects, so the largest projects that we find. And let me give you an example of the largest development projects in LA County, Lakewood. And this is one of the outputs that comes from our algorithm. So these are each dot here is one house. We have drawn one house randomly within this Lakewood project, and then we continued looping until we didn't find any more neighbors that were developed exactly in those 2 years, and then we stopped. And this is indeed traces the borders of an actual project that then we can check in the data in the newspapers if it was an actual project. And this is the Lakewood project. So our key measure here is going to be the fraction of homes that is built within the top 1% of projects. And what we see is that this fraction has been decreasing massively over time, going from north of 35% to south of 25%. And so the fraction of housing stock that America is developing within the largest kind of similar to Levittown projects is decreasing substantially. And this is because the largest of these top 1% projects are becoming smaller and smaller. Obviously, every year there is a top 1%, it's a relative definition, but the size of this top 1% is getting smaller and smaller. So in other words, we don't seem to have any more Levittowns today. So the theory asks whether regulation can explain our patterns. So just to recap, what we've seen is that productivity and size of firms and projects decreased over time, but especially since the 1970s. And the 1970s was a decade in which regulation also shot up. This is plotted in the yellow line, which is land uses per capita. This line comes from Ganong and Schoag's paper. And what we see is that in the 70s, really, regulation started increasing massively. And the red line plots one of the things that I've shown you, which is the difference in productivity between cars and houses, which starts going down exactly in the 70s. But if I had plotted, the size of projects or other kind of measures, you would see very similar patterns. So how can we reconcile these two facts that are happening in time series and all of this kind of motivating data that we are showing? And to do that, we present a new model of regulated construction in which we keep the demand side for now very simple. We're about to have an extension in the new revised draft in which we microfound it. But for now, let's keep it very simple because this is kind of a standard block. Our innovations are more on the supply side. So for now, just assume that expenditure in each city on housing is constant, and you could get this from an approximate Cobb-Douglas demand if local income is independent of regulation. It obviously is not, and again, we have an extension where we're about to post an extension where we microfound this. But the supply side is really the new part. And here what we have is that we have developers and landowners that partner to build on plots of lands. And so we will have an elastic supply of land, which comes from, you can think of heterogeneous landowners that have idiosyncratic reservation values or site preparation costs, so that if the price of land goes up, there's going to be someone that wants to supply more land. And then builders or entry of developers in the market is elastic to the revenues that are accruing to builders. And we have this using constructors that are heterogeneous in their productivity, but ex ante homogeneous. So they will draw a productivity once they enter, but ex ante they just have an expected productivity they draw, but they have an outside opportunity or taste for doing something else, which is not being a builder. And so that if revenues in buildings are higher, they will decide to go. So some marginal individuals, which were at the margin of becoming a producer, or a builder, or doing something else, will become builders. And then we will have real fixed cost of entry, some fixed cost that the builder has to pay in order to become a builder, which is common to all builders. And we think of this as partly due to entry regulation. What's useful of this fixed cost is which allows us to benchmark benchmark the effect of our kind of regulation, which is the project level that I'm about to show you, with the more standard entry regulation, which is, a barrier to entry to producers. So to construct a project, again, landowners and developers partner to build on one parcel. And our way of modeling construction regulation is that there is a stochastic probability of receiving a permit for the project. So meaning that sometimes I put in a permit, I want to do a development, I just don't receive it because it violates some regulation. And what we assume is that this probability of receiving a permit is decreasing in the size of the project BI. And this index of regulatory tightness goes from 0 to 1. If it's 0, the probability is 1 for any BI. If it's 1, it is going to go to be under bar, and then this is very negligible. So all projects don't get the permit. So if the permit is denied, the parcel becomes worthless, whereas if the permit is approved, construction then takes place. And the builder acts as the landowner's contractor, so it doesn't own the land, and the landowner decides to hire the builder to build, and they split the revenues in a way that clears the market. And obviously stop me for any clarifying questions or comments. So the productivity of the project is a Cobb-Douglas cost, which has 3 key components. One, obviously, it increases in size according to this BI to the 1 plus 1 divided by epsilon, but it also decreases in the developer's idiosyncratic potential A, which is this, which we assume is Pareto distributed and realized after entry. And then it also decreases in a technological investment that each producer that draws a productivity A can decide to do. So if the producer has many nice projects that is about to develop, obviously this K, the returns to decreasing K are going to be high because the producer is going to have a large scale on which to split the cost of reducing this K. And then importantly, this is the SI is the span of control, which means that the SI is the rank of the project within each developer. So if it's, which captures that the 100th project is more expensive than the 99th project, because again, the developer has to juggle through many sites, and this is costly for the developer. And obviously, we assume regularity condition on the primitive such that the number of buildings and the size of developer is finite. This also implies that kappa is greater than omega, so the returns to technological investment, 1 over kappa, rises lower than the span of control, which is the cost of adoption. This implies that the technological investment will be an interior solution. There's not going to be any corner solution for which is optimal to invest infinity in technology. So all developers are different in their their productivity term, and they will choose their span. They will choose to engage in as many projects until they hit their productivity threshold Z bar, which is determined by which exists because they could go and do something else. And so this greater potential allows greater scale for any technology investment. If I'm intrinsically more productive, I'm going to be bigger because I'm going to do more projects before I'm hitting my the productivity threshold Z bar, which is common for everyone. And this greater potential also leads to higher technology investment because I'm doing more projects. If I invest in K, this cost of K is split across many projects, so it's better for me to invest. And then obviously I get again greater scale, so more project, more housing, and more revenues. What this shows is that there is a positive two-way relationship between size and productivity. Obviously, causality doesn't go only in one way, but there is a positive relationship between the two, for which larger firms will have higher revenue to cost ratios, and this is a way we're being precise on the outcome because this is what we're going to test, and revenue to cost is higher because there is a fixed cost, and then they will have also higher revenues per employee if wages are fixed and the cost function is homothetic. And then it ends up being that developer revenue is going to be a constant fraction of the value of houses built, and the remainder is going to go to landowners. So remember, there is this partnership between the two. And obviously, the amount that is going to go to each is going to be determined in equilibrium. So we can look at what is the impact of regulation by distinguishing between two types of regulation. Project-level regulation, an increase in the row that you can see here in the permitting, which makes it less likely that large projects are permitted, and an increase instead in the psi, which is the fixed cost of entry. So with higher project regulation, what happens is that obviously developers will end up proposing smaller projects. And this means that construction is going to be more land intensive. For the same plot of land, now I have to use more land for the same amount of houses, or for the same plot of land, I will have to produce less houses because more houses are less likely to be approved. This increases the price pressure on land parcels, which means that builders are going to get a lower share of revenues. Under fixed consumption expenditure, because we're being very simple on demand, but again, we have robustness on that, fewer developers will end up remaining, because now the revenues in the sector are a little bit worse. The marginal developers that were indifferent between building or doing something else, or some of them are going to do something else. And now developers' revenues per developer will decline because they are inefficiently stretching over many projects, and they are giving more value to the landowners, which means that the returns to technological investment are going to be smaller, meaning the developer is shrinking, and obviously the investment is a cost that the developer pays at the firm level, and so it is endogenously gonna decrease, and this implies lower revenue over cost ratios in high regulation places. What happens to quantities is that buildings go down, but the price of buildings go up, whereas the amount of parcels supplied and the price of parcels go up. Intuitively, what's happening is that developers are inefficiently stretching across many projects, and they get less value per building. This decreases their TFP, and so this is just a negative supply shock for building and a positive demand shock for landowners. This is quite interesting. It has an interesting implication not necessarily maximizing the value of land is welfare improving, because this is actually increasing the value of land, but it's hurting consumers. In other words, what project regulation is doing is transferring some of the value from consumers and builders to the landowners, which are benefiting from this just because construction is becoming more land intensive.
Leonardo?
Yeah.
Yes, I have a question. Do you take into account in your model the fact that the more you construct, the more you have land available, then you restrict the full area of available land? Let me explain. So let's say you have 100 land available in 1950, but in 2000, you have no more land available. What it means that it impacts also the size of the projects, and maybe also the size of firms involved for this project. Do you have this in your model?
Yeah, no, so that's a great point. And I think it's a point that is especially, I was looking at least at price appreciation in Israel, and I was talking with some of some Israeli friends, and they've told me that this is one of the drivers for the land, is one of the drivers of this high price appreciation. In the US, we don't have this channel because in the US, in our project size analysis, we split, we look at areas in which there is a lot of land available. Think of the Atlanta metro area. And it is actually the case that projects have become smaller also in these kind of areas. So we think that really, while this is surely at play in some way, we think it's, it doesn't explain why projects have become small, even in areas of the US in which actually land is plentiful. So we don't have this, we don't think about this time series thing of like land is restricting over time in the US, because we see that actually, our main facts are happening also in places that are land where land is abundant.
Leo, can I make two comments on this?
Yeah.
So first of all, is in the question of the model is fundamentally static. And so what's happening is it's a comparison of, you have a fixed number of parcels that you can use, but the difference is in a more regulated space, they propose fewer units per parcel. So in some sense, the number of parcels is the restriction on the amount of land. And so in some sense, it's there in the model, but in a sense, because it's static, you don't have any of this accumulation over time. Second point that I just want to highlight, the big question in the US, in some sense, is whether or not we used to, in some sense, tear down stuff that's on existing land and build up stuff, which I think is what happened, and now we don't. But that requires a panel of places, and Joe, I mean, we're working on this. Joe and I are working on this in other work, but we're not there yet. But obviously, it's a great question. And I guess the third point that I never, want to stop making is there is an enormous amount of land in the United States, right? And you can basically put the entire world on 10th-acre lots in the state of Texas and Oklahoma together, and you'd be fine. So, you're never really going to run out of land.
Yeah. Thank you, Ed.
Is it? Yeah. Thank you very much, Ed. So I will just continue this question for specific cities like New York, Miami, Hawaii. Do you see also this unlimited amount of land in these cities?
I think more broad, obviously, I think for those cities that over time, have grown like some of the most dense US places, you don't have that. But it's still the case that, production could reallocate if other cities that have more land became cheaper and could actually exploit the scale of this land, that, people could reallocate to these cities. So that's why I think like we're focusing on this idea of like, the intensive use of each partial rather than again, it's not a dynamic model, but we wouldn't have this dynamic evolution of land. But definitely, of course. Yeah.
So Miami, I think the basic problem in the US is to try to build less in Miami rather than more. I think fundamentally, and there's a lot of oceanfront territory that is still being built on, probably counterproductively. In terms of once you get beyond New York. So for example, I am currently in Middlesex County, Massachusetts. Middlesex County, Massachusetts has a significantly lower population density than Harris County, Texas, that includes Houston. So it's not as if there isn't vast amounts of empty land, even within the heart of the Boston metropolitan area in which one could potentially build.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so let me go to the entry regulation, which is very different from what happens to project regulation. So, if you increase the cost of entry in the industry, you will have higher entry costs to defray, obviously, and this also means that there is going to be fewer developers remaining in the industry because someone is going to be marginally uncertain. Someone that was at the margin now has higher fixed costs, so it's going to do something else. And what happens to developer revenues is that they're going to increase because there's going to be fewer developers now, and they serve the same kind of demand. And so developers' revenue per developer will increase. And so this actually means that technological investment per developer is going to increase because the size of each developer goes up, and it has an ambiguous effect on revenues to cost ratio. And so it is still true that buildings quantities go down and prices go up because developers' productivity is going to decrease as they inefficiently stretch across many projects. But at least for entry regulation, there is a countervailing investment in technology. It is true that obviously this regulation still harms consumers. It restricts, it's still a negative supply shock on the building sector. However, it has this counterbalancing force that the incumbents, if there is a positive relationship between size and technological investment, as the model assumes there is, it has this countervailing effect. And so this is a really a difference that we want to highlight between regulation of projects or regulation of process and regulation of entry into an industry. So let me now shift to some tests of the model in the time I have remaining. So the first type of link that we investigate is the link between size and productivity, which is a link that we investigate across different firms. That from the 2012 longitudinal business database, we have here census microdata, and we have revenues, units produced, costs, and employment at the firm level. And then the second link is the one between regulation and size, and then obviously also productivity. And this is going to be a cross-sectional link that we investigate across cities using the Worluri Index of Regulatory Tightness in residential construction. As I've already anticipated, this is an index that measures how many steps do build and how many permits, how many agencies do builders need to reach out to get construction going, and it's developed by Joe Jurko and other coders at Wharton. And then there is a city level data on, we have city level data on size and productivity in construction that comes from public data and from aggregating census data. And then we have housing units per capita. So the first thing that we show is that really large firms seem to be more productive. Again, obviously, this is, as also the model makes clear, this is not a causal one-way relationship, but it is a causal two-way relationship. And what we see is that here we plot units per employee across different size of bins for housing constructing firms. And so firms with 500 and plus employees that build houses, there are very few of them, but they are extremely productive. They build 4 times as many housing units compared to very small firms. But even those that build 100 and plus, they build twice as much. 20 to 99 build 50% as much. And also revenues per employee are increasing over the size distribution, which is not only so it's not only a matter of quantity. It's also, you can see it also in revenues. If you take a standard regression across firms of profits and log labor productivity, which is basically housing units per employee, and capital per employee, you see that an increase, a 10% increase in long employment is in employment size is associated with a 1% higher productivity and a 0.7% higher capital per employee. If we look at across cities, and now we look at the size between the link between size and regulation and productivity and regulation, we see that highly regulated areas have smaller firms. Here I'm in the first panel. I'm regressing the fraction of employees in large firms on the index of regulatory tightness, and what we see is that for all types of construction, but especially for construction of buildings, places with higher Worluri, with a higher level of regulatory tightness, or those that have a smaller firms. Obviously, in panel B, what we do in panel B is we, instead of using the raw Worluri, we project Worluri using some determinants of Worluri at the place level, which are demographics and educational determinants. And so we have our Worluri predicted, and so which allows us to extend our analysis to all cities, regardless of whether they answered the original Worluri survey from which Joe and coders get the index. And what we see is that the results are broadly the same. One standard decrease in Worluri is associated with a 2.5% reduction in fraction of employment in large firms. This is economically significant, it's 14% at the mean, and then a 4.3% decline in construction of buildings, so in construction of what you can think of houses and offices, and this is 38% of the mean, even more economically significant. If we take our data from the census on capital per firm, revenues per employee, of measures of productivity at the firm level and size at the firm level, and also the size of the construction sector with housing units built per capita, we see that across all of these measures, these are negative, negatively correlated with Worluri. So column 1 to 3 is just showing you that revenues per firm, payroll per firm, and capital per firm are smaller in highly regulated places. This just means that firms are smaller. Columns 4 to 6 shows that these things normalized per employee are also smaller, which means that these firms are less productive. And column 7 and 8 tells you that the size of the construction sectors in terms of units and in terms of revenues is also depressed in this area. So this kind of tests the main predictions of the model, which is that, obviously only correlationally, which is that in these highly regulated places, we will see a depressed construction sector, small firms, and unproductive firms. Then the last implication of the model is also that this rise of regulation, by making producers smaller and inefficiently and decreasing their size, also decrease the benefit of investing in technological development. Obviously, the technological development, can be applied to many projects. If I don't do too many buildings, if I don't do as many as them, my incentives of investing in technology are going to be smaller. So in the time series, we should see that construction indeed is getting less innovative compared to other sectors. And this is exactly what we see if we take what I'm plotting here is the patents in each sector indexed to their 1930 levels. And so what we see in construction is really a large decoupling between construction and the rest of the economy, which again seems to become particularly stark in the 80s and in the 70s and 80s. So here, obviously, what this is showing is that really the construction innovativeness has slumped compared to the rest of the economy. And we have in the paper some graphs that also show that innovativeness in manufacturing sectors that serve construction industry has also decreased over time. And this is a way to check whether maybe, construction is not getting more productive because their suppliers are getting very innovative, but this does not seem to be the case.
Leonardo?
Yeah.
I just have a question about this figure. So there is two kind of conclusions that we can have. So one side, we can say that we have less and less or more and more small companies or small firms, which, but it does not fit with the fact that we are more innovative. But on the second way, we can think about concentration effects, where we have, I don't know, 5 very big companies that concentrate most of the innovation. I mean, how do you deal with these competition effects by explaining this figure?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I mean, this is kind of also related to the idea of regulation of entry, right? I mean, you entrench incumbents, obviously they're getting a little bit more competitive, but at least if it is true that larger firms are more better able to do R&D, then you would have at least this countervailing force from added competition and from added monopoly, which is that maybe they get a little bit more technologically innovative. Here in this case, we just see that the firms are getting smaller and they are also getting they're getting smaller, but they're also getting less innovative. It is true that maybe a counterbalancing force is that the producer themselves are getting less monopolistic. However, in the model, who's getting a lot of monopoly rent here is going to be the landowners. So you have also this kind of other margin of transferring value from the consumers and the builders to the landowners. So it's true that the builders are getting smaller, but it is also true that the landowners are getting much more of the value of the construction because their scarce input is getting more important in the construction process. But this is broadly just a descriptive fact, which is that which just says that innovativeness in the sector has gone down, and this follows the fact that the sector is going to be smaller. That is going to be smaller. We don't have anything to say. This figure has nothing to say in itself on competition in the industry. Although our other measures of construction do kind of step. They distinguish from that. For instance, if you think at real costs of construction, those are not the price, they're really the cost, and then units also, they're not the price, they're really units. For those kind of measures, we've seen the similar pattern that they have gone down, which really talks about something that seems intrinsic to the productivity of the builders.
So if I can just add on this,
yeah.
Leo. So I think it's almost assuredly true that we don't think that the builders are getting some, massive amount of rents from what they're doing. There's small scale operations, and that virtue of competition probably is working. Although in many construction relationships, something that begins as being highly competitive ex ante then becomes in the building process a one-on-one bargaining situation ex post. So it's not clear if those ex post rents get bargained away ex ante. Anyone who's ever engaged in their own building project sort of understands this process. The other thing I think that's really important to highlight this is I've written many papers over the last 35 years, 33 years, suggesting that there are all sorts of virtues of having lots of little establishments at the place-based level. I think one of the things just that seems to happen with those is often those little establishments become big establishments. And that's how the dynamic competitive process actually does relatively good things. In construction, that's kind of impossible, which is the point of our model, because these little firms, even if you're like a slightly better builder, like you can't take on 50 different projects because you're just stymied by the process. So this sort of the dynamic, one positive aspect of construction is probably at work here, which is they're not probably getting huge rents from this. The other side, which is you've got lots of different guys who are experimenting with different things, and then the winners grow and you get advantages from that. That I don't think you're getting at all.
Yeah, thank you, Ed.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so let me conclude with a little bit of an overview of what we did. We've provided several facts on the construction industry. We've seen an unproductive sector that has low TFP growth over time and is made by small firms that are working on small projects. We argue that the rise of regulation can explain part of these patterns. It not only bids up prices by restricting the legally developable land, but there is a new effect. It can also make builders themselves less productive over time. And we've provided some cross-sectional tests of the model, but obviously we think that more work is needed on the link between regulation and firm size, and then between firm size in construction and productivity. And obviously this work can further shed light on whether on this big problem in the US, which is the rise in ultimately the gigantic rise in house prices. And with that, that's all I had, and thank you very much for being here.